In a single year, he lost the most watched role on American television, tens of millions of dollars of his own money, and an 18-year marriage. Man, that's brutal. It wasn't the first time Kevin Costner lost everything at once. There's a certain kind of man Hollywood loves to build up, and then loves even more to tear down. A guy who won 2 Oscars, smashed box office records around the world, and got called reckless for betting on stories nobody else had the guts to tell. A man the industry crowned, publicly humiliated, quietly forgot, and then had to sit back and watch come back as the most watched actor on American television at 65 years old. But what the spotlight never showed was the real price of every single one of those bets. What it cost the family waiting at home while he was out there building legends. The silence that piled up while the whole world stood up and cheered. The second chance he wrecked the exact same way he wrecked the first one. So how does a kid who never felt like he belonged anywhere end up becoming the defining symbol of American conviction? What really went down on the set of Waterworld? And why doesn't he regret a single damn day of it? What caused 2 marriages to collapse at the exact moment his career hit its highest point? And what drives a man to dump $38 million of his own money into a project the entire industry called straight-up madness for the second time? To answer any of that, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning. Back to a kid who was always the new guy in town and learned to read every room before he even stepped into it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that only the kid who's always the new one understands. Kevin Michael Costner was born on January 18, 1955 in Linwood, California, the 3rd son of Sharon Ray and William Costner. His father was a utility worker for Southern California Edison, a practical dude who believed in discipline, routine, and the quiet dignity of honest work. His mom was warm, loving, but stretched thin, raising 3 boys while life kept them constantly on the move. The family moved all the time. Compton, Delano, Visalia, Villa Park. Every few years, boom. New town, new school, new group of strangers. Kevin later admitted with a kind of raw honesty that growing up, he never really felt like he belonged anywhere. Every time he showed up somewhere new, the friendships were already formed, the social ladders already built, the invisible walls already standing. I was always the new kid, he said years later. And when you're always the new kid, you learn to observe. You learn to read a room before you walk into it. That habit, watching first, acting second, studying people before trusting them, would become the invisible foundation of everything he built as an actor. But back then, it was just loneliness wearing a mask of adaptability. What saved him during those years of constant change were 2 things: water and words. Kevin fell in love with swimming early. He trained seriously enough that for a minute it actually looked like it might become his future. But stories had an even stronger grip on him. He devoured books, lost himself in movies, started writing poetry as a teenager, private verses nobody else ever read, confessions he wasn't ready to say out loud. At church, he sang in the choir. Without realizing it, he was already developing the instinct for performance, for feeling something deeply and projecting it out to a room full of strangers. His parents were church-going Baptists, and faith shaped the rhythm of the household. But the thing that shaped Kevin the most wasn't doctrine. It was his father's relentless work ethic. William Costner wasn't the kind of guy who tolerated laziness. If you weren't building something, you were wasting time. That lesson dug deep into Kevin's bones. Decades later, when Hollywood laughed at his ambitions, he wouldn't argue. He'd just go ahead and build it anyway. At California State University, Fullerton, Kevin studied business administration, a safe, practical choice. Acting still felt too risky, too exposed, too far from the grounded world his father lived in. So he played the responsible card, studied business, kept the dream quiet. But the dream refused to stay quiet. During college, he started sneaking into acting classes on the side, showing up to workshops and small theater productions, almost like he was testing whether the feeling was real or just some fantasy. Turns out, it was real. It burned hotter than anything else in his life. By the time he graduated in 1978, he made a decision that scared the hell out of him. He was going all in on acting, not as a hobby, not as a backup plan, as everything. His parents weren't mean about it, but they were honest. His father saw the odds clearly. A man who'd spent his whole life doing practical work knew how brutal those odds were. The conversation wasn't a fight. It was just the heavy silence of someone who loved him asking him to be realistic. Kevin heard the concern, but he didn't change course. He married Cindy Silva in 1978, his college sweetheart. She'd stand beside him through the years of total obscurity that followed. Those early years weren't glamorous. Not even close. They were pure survival mode. Kevin worked as a stagehand, drove trucks, worked in a fish hatchery, took whatever job came his way, and he kept auditioning. Over and over again. Rejections piled up like crazy. Hollywood at that time barely noticed Kevin Costner. He landed tiny roles, blink and you miss it appearances in movies nobody remembers. Casting directors basically filed him under. Fine, but nothing special. The industry machine rolled forward without him. And every single day he pushed against it with the stubborn determination of a guy who'd been the new kid in too many towns to believe belonging was something you waited for. Then came the moment that almost killed his career before it even started. In 1983, Kevin got cast in a small but meaningful role in Lawrence Kasdan's film The Big Chill. The movie followed a group of college friends reuniting after the death of a friend. Kevin played the dead friend. His scenes were filmed as flashbacks. He prepared like crazy, put everything he had into those quiet moments on set. Then the editor cut him completely. Not shortened, not reduced, gone. The only thing left of him in the final movie was a shot of his legs being dressed for burial. He had worked for years to get that opportunity, and just like that it vanished. Most people would have taken that as the universe saying game over. Kevin Costner took it as a warning he refused to accept. Lawrence Kasdan actually felt terrible about the whole thing. He reached out afterward and promised Kevin another shot, a real one. That chance came in 1985 with Silverado. A sweeping western that finally gave Kevin Costner a stage worthy of what he'd been quietly carrying inside all those years. The new kid had finally found a place to belong. And man, he wasn't about to let it slip away. Silverado didn't instantly make Kevin Costner a superstar, but it did something just as important. It made Hollywood look again. The film was packed with established actors: Danny Glover, Scott Glenn, Jeff Goldblum, Kevin Kline. And yet Costner held his own with this effortless, almost dangerous charisma. He was relaxed where others were stiff, magnetic where others were just decent. People noticed, directors noticed, and slowly, the same industry that ignored him for years started turning its attention his way. What happened next wasn't a slow climb. It was a detonation. In 1987, The Untouchables placed Kevin Costner opposite Sean Connery and Robert De Niro, two absolute giants of cinema. And he didn't shrink for a second. As Elliot Ness, he anchored the film with quiet moral strength. The performance proved what Silverado had hinted at. This guy didn't need the camera to find him. He already knew exactly where to stand. Then came Bull Durham in 1988, and everything changed. The film was smaller, funnier, warmer. A love story wrapped around minor league baseball, a world full of dusty fields and almost great players chasing dreams. Costner didn't play a hero. He played a flawed, self-aware, quietly romantic man who talked about life and belief like it was the most natural thing in the world. The movie blew up, and overnight Kevin Costner became the leading man everyone in Hollywood wanted. Scripts started stacking up at his door. Then came 1989, Field of Dreams. And that film locked something in forever about what Kevin Costner represented on screen. He wasn't Schwarzenegger. He wasn't Stallone. He was something different. He was the regular guy who believed in impossible things. The man who builds a baseball field in a cornfield just because a mysterious voice told him to. And audiences believed him. When he said the line, "If you build it, he will come." It should have sounded ridiculous. Instead, it became legendary. But the moment that truly crowned him came in 1990. Because Kevin Costner decided to do something Hollywood told him not to do. He directed himself in a massive western called Dances with Wolves, about a Union soldier who discovers his humanity living among the Lakota Sioux. The film was nearly 3 hours long. It took place in a historical period studios believed was box office poison. Large parts of the dialogue were spoken entirely in Lakota, unsubtitled and unhurried. Every Hollywood calculation said the movie would flop. Instead, Dances with Wolves won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. At the 63rd Academy Awards, Kevin Costner stood at the podium, no longer Hollywood's risky gamble, but its undisputed champion. He hadn't just made a successful film. He proved audiences were starving for depth, beauty, and emotional complexity, way more than the industry believed. And he had bet his own money, his own reputation, and his own name on that belief. He was 35 years old, the most powerful actor-director in the world, and the kid who once felt like he belonged nowhere suddenly had his name on everything. But what the applause couldn't show was the price already building in the shadows. The same obsession that carried him to the Oscars was slowly reshaping his private life. Because while Kevin was out there building a legend, his wife Cindy was starting to feel the distance growing at home. On the set of Dances with Wolves, he spent months in remote South Dakota directing, acting, and solving problems around the clock. He was completely present for the film, but less and less present for his family. Cindy had been there through the hardest years, the rejections, the truck-driving jobs, the fish hatchery shifts. She believed in him before Hollywood ever did. She raised their children, Annie, Lily, and Joe, while he chased the dream. Now the dream had finally arrived, and she found herself standing on the outside of it. Years later, Kevin admitted it with painful honesty. I wasn't as present as I should have been. I was always somewhere else in my head. But back in 1990, none of that had fully surfaced yet, because in 1992, The Bodyguard exploded at the box office. Costner starred alongside Whitney Houston in one of the most iconic screen romances of the decade. The soundtrack became one of the best-selling albums in music history, and Kevin Costner wasn't just respected anymore. He was a global phenomenon, the kind of star whose name alone could greenlight any movie, fill any theater, silence any room. He had built it, and they had come, all of them, and standing at the absolute peak of American cinema, with Oscars on his shelf, hundreds of millions at the box office, and the whole world watching his every move. Kevin Costner made a decision that would define the next chapter of his life. He decided to build something even bigger, and by doing that, he lit the fuse on one of the biggest explosions Hollywood had ever seen. Because there's a type of courage the world only recognizes later. In the moment, it looks exactly like insane madness. By 1993, Kevin Costner had earned the rarest currency in Hollywood, unconditional trust. Studios would greenlight projects just because his name was attached. Producers returned his calls before the first ring even finished. The guy who once drove trucks and cleaned fish for a living was now pulling $15 million per film. What in every major director in the industry considered him their first call. He could have coasted. He could have chosen safe, profitable films that demanded nothing from him but his face and his name. A lot of guys in his position did exactly that and lived comfortably inside the warm, easy glow of maintained stardom. Kevin Costner, though, said nah. He chose a flooded apocalypse instead. The project was called Waterworld, a science fiction epic set in a future where the polar ice caps had melted entirely, drowning every continent beneath an endless, merciless ocean. The last survivors of humanity drifted on floating atolls, fighting over scraps of dirt and the fading memory of dry land. Kevin would star as the Mariner, a solitary, gill-bearing mutant navigating this drowned world with cold ferocity and buried humanity. By any normal measure, this was a straight-up insane gamble. The original budget was set at approximately $100 million, already the most expensive film ever proposed at that point in cinema history. Kevin didn't just commit to star in it. He stepped in as a producer, putting in his own money, staking his own credibility, and attaching his name to every single decision made on that production. What followed wasn't just a difficult shoot. It was a long, public, increasingly humiliating catastrophe. Filming took place almost entirely on open ocean near Hawaii on a massive artificial atoll built at staggering cost. The structure kept getting wrecked by storms. Equipment sank. Schedules collapsed. The Hawaiian waters, beautiful from the shore, were brutal and unpredictable in reality. Saltwater corroding machinery. Currents messing up carefully planned shots. The relentless Pacific basically saying, yeah, your timetable means nothing to me. The budget ballooned. First to $130 million, then $150, and then $175 million. A number so crazy for 1995 that the press couldn't stop repeating it. Kevin Costner, once the golden boy of American cinema, had now become the punchline of every industry conversation. Kevin's gills, Fishtar, a savage reference to the legendary flop Ishtar, basically signaling that history was about to repeat itself on a catastrophic scale. Late-night hosts sharpened their jokes. Trade publications ran daily updates on the spiraling budget like they were covering a slow-motion train wreck. And Kevin was right there in the middle of it, every day on the water in the heat, soaked, sunburned, and refusing to quit. Reports from the set weren't exactly kind either. Stories floated around about creative tension with director Kevin Reynolds, disagreements over the film's tone and direction, and an atmosphere thick with pressure and frustration. Reynolds eventually walked away before post-production was finished, leaving Kevin to guide the film through its final stages pretty much on his own. When Waterworld finally hit theaters in July 1995, the reviews weren't the massacre the press had promised. They were worse. They were indifferent. Critics admitted the ambition and scale but brushed off the execution. The film wasn't the disaster its critics had gleefully predicted. It actually performed fairly well worldwide and eventually made a profit once international sales and home video were counted. But by then, profit didn't even matter anymore. The narrative had already been written. Waterworld had become the symbol of excess, ego, and a star who had flown too close to the sun. Every article, every late-night monologue, every whisper in Hollywood repeated the same verdict. Kevin Costner had overreached. The king had stumbled. And Hollywood, the same place that had worshipped him just 5 years earlier, now watched his struggles with barely hidden satisfaction. The cruelty was precise. The same industry that ignored him for a decade, then adored him for half a decade, suddenly turned its back with the casual efficiency of people who had never truly believed in him in the first place. Kevin later admitted, with the calm of a man who had already carried the wound for years, "I knew the film wasn't what we hoped it would be, but I also knew we gave everything we had. I don't regret trying. I regret that we didn't get to finish it the way we intended." But the empire didn't stop burning with Waterworld. In 1997, still carrying the weight of that public humiliation, Kevin returned with The Postman, another massive, ambitious epic set in a post-apocalyptic America. A story about hope, community, and the stubborn human need for connection even when civilization is lying in ruins. He directed it himself. He poured every bit of conviction into it, just like he had with Dances with Wolves 7 years earlier. The difference this time was that the world had already made up its mind about him. The Postman got absolutely wrecked by critics. Reviewers who might have considered its themes under different circumstances arrived already locked into the narrative of Costner's downfall and saw the film's sincerity as nothing but proof of delusion. The movie lost tens of millions of dollars. The Razzie Awards nominated it in nearly every category. Worst Picture, Worst Director, Worst Actor. Kevin's name attached to each one like a public flogging. 7 years earlier, he had stood on the Academy Awards stage accepting Best Director. Now he was being handed mock trophies for the worst work in Hollywood. Still, he didn't disappear. He didn't melt down in public. He showed up for interviews and answered questions with the quiet dignity of someone who had decided that falling apart simply wasn't an option. But the cost of that composure was invisible to everyone watching. Behind the calm exterior, the empire wasn't just burning professionally. It was burning personally too. And the fire that would do the deepest damage wasn't lit on a movie set or on the ocean. It had been burning at home for years. Some men lose everything in a single dramatic moment. Others lose it slowly, quietly, in the spaces between success, in the silences that build up when ambition fills every room and leaves no space for the people who were there before the applause started. Kevin Costner was that second kind of man. His marriage to Cindy Silva had begun in the most normal, human way imaginable. They were college sweethearts at Cal State Fullerton. Just two young people choosing each other before either one of them had anything to offer except honesty and the fragile promise of a shared future. Cindy hadn't married a movie star. She had married a guy who drove trucks and dreamed about acting. A man who came home with rejection every night and woke up the next morning ready to face it again. She chose him when he was invisible, and that choice meant everything. Through the tough early 1980s, through the tiny roles, the near misses, and even the humiliation of being cut entirely from the big chill, Cindy stayed the constant. The steady presence that made the chaos survivable. Together they built a family. Annie, Lily, and Joe. 3 kids growing up in the long shadow of a dream that always seemed just about to happen. And then it finally did. The same year Dances with Wolves dominated the Academy Awards and put Kevin Costner at the absolute peak of global cinema. The cracks in his marriage, cracks that had been forming quietly for years, became impossible to ignore. The same traits that made him extraordinary on screen were the ones quietly damaging his life off screen. The obsession, the total immersion in whatever world he was building, the inability to be present anywhere he wasn't actively creating something. Fame at that level doesn't just change the person who receives it. It reshapes every relationship around them. Suddenly there are assistants, lawyers, producers, publicists filling every hour of the day. Suddenly the family home stops being a refuge and becomes just another satellite orbiting a career that never slows down. Suddenly the woman who stood beside you in obscurity finds herself standing beside a version of you that the entire world now claims. Cindy filed for divorce in 1994, 16 years of marriage, 3 children, and a settlement reported to be close to $80 million, one of the largest divorce settlements in Hollywood history at the time. The money hurt. But Kevin later made it clear that the financial hit was the smallest part of what the divorce cost him. What it cost him couldn't be measured in dollars. It was the quiet realization of a man who chased something extraordinary and left something irreplaceable behind. "I was not the husband I should have been," he admitted years later. "I was not as present as she deserved." That's the truth. No excuses. No blame shifting. Just a man owning his mistakes. What made it even more brutal was the timing. The divorce happened at exactly the same moment Waterworld was being publicly ridiculed. In the mid-1990s, Kevin Costner was losing his marriage and his professional standing at the exact same time. The media, of course, treated both like entertainment. Tabloids dissected the divorce. Trade magazines dissected the box office numbers. And Kevin walked through both storms in full public view with a calm that many people mistook for coldness, but was really something closer to controlled grief. He kept working, always working, but people close to him during those years noticed the change. He wasn't broken, but he was different, quieter, more careful. The easy swagger of the early 1990s had been replaced by something more watchful. A man who understood how fragile success really is. After the divorce, Kevin entered a rebuilding phase that wasn't smooth or simple. He dated publicly, his relationships tracked by the relentless microscope of celebrity culture. But one thing stayed constant. He remained deeply committed as a father. People around him described a man who showed up for his kids with a consistency he hadn't managed to give his marriage. Then in 2004, he married Christine Baumgartner, a handbag designer he had known for several years. Christine was quieter than the Hollywood world surrounding Kevin. Private, grounded, comfortable standing beside his career instead of inside it. For 18 years, their marriage looked like the redemption story. The second chapter written with the wisdom gained from the first chapter's mistakes. Kevin spoke about her with the warmth of a man who believed he had finally learned something important about himself. They had 3 children together, Caden, Hayes, and Grace. And Kevin built a life around them that, from the outside, seemed balanced at last. The ranch in Aspen, the house in Santa Barbara, the slower rhythm of a man who had survived his own excesses and chosen presence over empire. But underneath that quiet life, another storm was slowly forming. Because Kevin's relationship with his work had never actually changed. The obsession, the total commitment, the refusal to let go once a vision took hold. Those weren't habits he had grown out of. They were simply who he was. And in the late 2010s, that obsession found a new target. A television series set on the vast ranch lands of Montana. A project so huge, so demanding, so completely Kevin Costner in its ambition that it would eventually cost him more than Waterworld and the divorce from Cindy Silva combined. Not in money, in everything else. But before that final storm arrived, something unexpected happened. A resurrection. A comeback so surprising and so complete that Hollywood, the same industry that had spent a decade writing him off, had no choice but to watch in stunned silence as the man they thought was finished rebuilt himself from the ground up. And he didn't do it in a studio office or a fancy boardroom. He did it on horseback, in the dust of Montana, in front of more viewers than most of his critics had ever reached in their entire careers. Hollywood has a funny way of forgetting people. There's no big announcement, no dramatic exile, no single door slammed shut. It's quieter than that. Calls come a little slower. Roles start going to younger names. And eventually a silent agreement spreads through the industry that your chapter has ended and the story is moving on without you. By the mid-2000s, Kevin Costner had felt that chill firsthand. The films kept coming. Open Range in 2003 and The Upside of Anger in 2005, Mr. Brooks in 2007, and each one straight up showed that his craft had not diminished one bit. If anything, the humiliations of the 1990s had deepened him as a performer, stripped away the invincibility, and replaced it with something more textured, more human, more honest. Critics who really paid attention to his work during this period noticed a new quality in his performances. A lived-in gravity that could only come from a man who had genuinely lost things he valued. But the audience numbers were smaller. The cultural conversation had moved on. Kevin Costner to the broader public had become a figure of nostalgia rather than urgency. A name tied to a particular golden era that felt more and more distant. He did not rage against that diminishment. He worked around it. He invested in music, touring with his band Kevin Costner and Modern West, playing smaller venues with the chill, unpretentious enthusiasm of a guy who simply loved performing, no matter the scale. He focused on his children, on his ranch, on the slower rhythms of a life built around presence rather than dominance. And then in 2018, Taylor Sheridan called. Sheridan was a writer and director whose work, Sicario, Hell or High Water, Wind River, had already established him as one of the most compelling voices in contemporary American storytelling. His scripts carried the weight of landscape and the messy moral complexity of men caught between competing loyalties, between law and survival, between love and ambition. He was building a television series about a powerful Montana ranching dynasty, a family clinging to their land against the encroachment of developers, politicians, and the relentless machinery of modern America. He wanted Kevin Costner to be John Dutton. The role was not some easy throwback to nostalgia. It was not a gentle reminder of past glories wrapped in comfortable familiarity. John Dutton was a man of real contradictions, ruthless in protecting what he loved, tender in the private moments the world never saw, carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who had fought the same damn war for so long that victory and survival had become almost the same thing. Kevin Costner read the script and recognized something in those pages that went beyond an acting opportunity. He recognized himself. Yellowstone premiered on the Paramount Network in June 2018, and the response was not immediate thunder. It built slowly, organically, through word of mouth and the fierce loyalty of an audience that felt, maybe for the first time in years, that a major television production was speaking directly to them instead of talking past them. Viewers in rural America, in ranching communities, in the vast middle of the country that Hollywood so often ignored, found in Yellowstone a world that reflected their own. Its landscapes, its values, its unresolved tensions between tradition and transformation. By its third and fourth seasons, Yellowstone had become the most watched show on American cable television. Not just in its demographic, not just in its time slot. In all of cable television. More than 10 million viewers per episode. A cultural phenomenon that no algorithm had predicted and no studio executive had greenlit with real confidence. Kevin Costner at 65 years old was the biggest star on American television. The industry that had cooled toward him watched in genuine astonishment. The man they had basically filed under nostalgia was pulling audiences that the prestige streaming platforms were spending billions trying to attract. He had not chased the resurrection. He had simply told the truth on screen with the same total commitment he had always brought to every role, and the audience found him. But the triumph arrived wrapped in a tension that the public would not fully understand until it cracked open in the most public and painful way possible. Behind the scenes of Yellowstone, a conflict had been building between Kevin Costner and the show's production over his availability for filming. Kevin had, at the same time as Yellowstone's success, committed himself to the most ambitious project of his later career. Horizon, an American saga, a 4-part epic western he had been developing for decades. A sweeping examination of westward expansion in post-Civil War America that he would direct, produce, and star in all at once. The project consumed him completely. Financing it required him to invest tens of millions of his own money. Reports estimated his personal contribution at $38 million. Scheduling it around Yellowstone's production demands became increasingly impossible, and the negotiations that followed were, by multiple accounts, bruising and impossible to reconcile. In May 2023, it was announced that Kevin Costner would not return for the second half of Yellowstone's 5th season. The press framed it as a departure. Those closer to the situation described it as something more painful, a collision between two total commitments, neither of which Kevin was willing to surrender, resulting in the loss of one by default. And the timing was brutal in its precision. Just 1 month later, in June 2023, Christine Baumgartner filed for divorce. 18 years of marriage. 3 children. The relationship Kevin had built as the corrected version of himself. The wiser, more present, more deliberate man who had learned from the failures of his first marriage was ending. The reasons were private, as both parties maintained with consistent dignity throughout the proceedings. But the timing was merciless. Kevin was simultaneously losing the television show that had rebuilt his cultural relevance, absorbing the financial pressure of a massively expensive independent film, and navigating the collapse of his second marriage. The tabloids ran the divorce and the Yellowstone departure as parallel storylines, treating both as evidence of a man in freefall. The settlement negotiations were contentious and public, reported in exhausting detail that neither Kevin nor Christine had invited. The proceedings stretched across months, conducted in the glare of a press that had never really lost its appetite for his struggles. When the divorce was finalized in late 2023, Kevin Costner had lost, within the space of a single year, his marriage, his most commercially successful role, and tens of millions of dollars invested in a film the industry was already watching with skeptical eyes. Horizon, an American Saga Chapter 1 was released in June 2024. It was, by any honest assessment, exactly what Kevin Costner had always been: ambitious, earnest, deeply committed, and operating at a scale that defied easy commercial calculation. Critics acknowledged its scope and sincerity. Audiences, shaped by decades of faster-paced storytelling, struggled to meet it on its own unhurried terms. The box office was disappointing. Chapter 2, originally scheduled for a theatrical release that same summer, was pulled from the calendar. The man who had once been told Dances with Wolves was too long, too quiet, too earnest to succeed, and then proved them wrong with 7 Oscars, now found himself in the exhausting position of defending a vision the world was not yet ready to receive. He stood in front of cameras at Cannes, composed and unbroken, and said the words that had defined his entire life. "I believe in this story. I will finish it." It was not defiance for its own sake. It was not ego refusing to acknowledge reality. It was simply Kevin Costner being exactly who he had always been. The boy who was always the new kid. The man who drove trucks and dreamed of something bigger. The director who built a baseball diamond in a cornfield because a voice told him to. The actor who bet everything on a flooded apocalypse, on a Montana ranch, and on a 4-part Western epic that the industry called madness. He had always been willing to stand alone in the field and believe that if he built it, they would come. That faith had broken him more than once. It had also given him everything he ever loved. In the autumn of 2024, Kevin Costner turned 69 years old. He did not mark the occasion with a press release or some carefully staged public appearance. He spent it, by all accounts, the way he had learned to spend the things that mattered most. Quietly, privately, with his children nearby and the wide, unhurried landscape of the American West somewhere in his line of sight. The man who had once commanded $15 million per film. The man who had swept the Academy Awards and smashed box office records, and been both crowned and crucified by the most powerful entertainment industry in the world, had arrived at a place that no amount of money or fame had ever been able to manufacture for him during the years when he had everything. Peace. Not the peace of a man who had stopped caring. Not the resignation of someone who had done the math and accepted the remainder. But the specific peace of a man who has been tested at every level, financially, physically, personally, professionally, and has discovered through the heavy weight of real loss what actually lasts. His children last. All of them. Annie, Lily, and Joe from his marriage to Cindy. Liam, his son with Bridget Rooney. And Caden, Hayes, and Grace from his years with Christine. They are the architecture of a life built not in studios or boardrooms, but in the ordinary, irreplaceable accumulation of presence. Kevin has spoken about fatherhood with a tenderness that his earlier, more armored self might barely recognize. A man who understands now, with the clarity that only real loss can bring, that the most important performances of his life have never been captured on film. His craft still holds. He is still writing, still developing Horizon's remaining chapters with the patient conviction of a man who knows some stories simply need more time than the world is willing to give them at first. He has been here before. He built a baseball diamond in a cornfield. He danced with wolves on the South Dakota plains. He knows what it means to believe in something before anyone else is ready to believe in it with you. His identity holds. Not the identity built by tabloids and trade publications and the industry's endlessly recycled stories of rise and fall and rise again. The identity that was always there underneath all of it. The restless boy from Linwood who watched before he acted, who wrote private poetry that nobody else read, who chose the exposed and vulnerable path of storytelling instead of the safe and sensible path of business administration, and never once in 40 years of public life pretended to be anything other than exactly who he was. That refusal to pretend has cost him a hell of a lot. It has also been the one thing about him that was never for sale. The greatest stars of any era are not defined by their peaks. They are defined by what they choose to protect when everything around them is falling apart. What they refuse to surrender even when surrender would be easier, cleaner, less painful. Kevin Costner chose his stories. He chose his children. He chose the belief that if you build something with real conviction and total commitment, the right audience will eventually find their way to it. He has been wrong about the timing more than once. He has never been wrong about the building. And maybe that is the truest measure of a life lived on one's own terms. Not that every gamble paid off. Not that every relationship survived. Not that every vision was received the way it deserved. But that when the noise finally quieted, the applause faded, and the industry moved on to its next obsession, the man still standing in the field was still himself. Completely, unapologetically, irreducibly himself. If his journey moved you, if you have ever bet on something you believed in despite the odds, or lost something that mattered more than you knew how to explain, or simply refused to stop building when the world told you to quit, then leave a like as a tribute to a man who never once pretended that the field was anything other than exactly what it was. Subscribe for more untold stories of the lives behind the legends. Because the most powerful thing about Kevin Costner's story is not the Oscars or the billions or the global fame. It is the simplest and most human thing of all. He kept going. Even when it cost him everything, he kept going.